Good morning, everyone. It is Sunday, August the 20th, and today is actually my brother's birthday, but today's edition of the Sports Note is going to be a little bit more somber. First of all, happy birthday, Frank. If you see this a little bit later, I'll be calling you a little bit later on today as well. I know you're out of town. But the hockey world lost one of the all-time greats on late Thursday night. I didn't even see the report until early on Friday morning, and that was the passing of legendary Buffalo Sabres broadcaster Rick Jeanneret at the age of 81. Jeanneret was born in July of 1942 in St. Catharines, Ontario, but essentially called Buffalo home for the majority of the second half of his life. The Sabres have only had 3 broadcasters in the entire history of the franchise. And Jeanneret came on in the second year of the franchise in the 1971-72 season, as the Sabres were founded in the 70-71 year. And Jeanneret called 51 years of Sabres games. Now, granted, towards the last maybe 5, 6, 7 years, his workload has diminished dramatically. Jeanneret was also diagnosed with stage 3 throat cancer in July of 2014. He received a clean bill of health and was basically back calling Sabres games very early into that season. So he was back on the microphone by November of 2014. Jeanneret actually had told many that he was that his 50th season was going to be his last, but then that turned out to be the COVID year where nobody was at games. So Jeanneret returned for the 2021-2022 season, where fans were let back into the buildings in full capacity. And even though the Sabres were not going to contend for a playoff spot like they're on the verge of doing now, Jeanneret did call 20 games for the team and had a very, very emotional and wonderful send-off as the Sabres won in a shootout in the season finale that year. Then flash forward to last year, and the Sabres actually retired Jeanneret's name to the rafters at the KeyBank Center in downtown Buffalo. There is strong feeling that the RJ patch that adorned their jerseys last year, more specifically their home jerseys, is going to be on there for this year. There is going to be certainly a moment of silence, and opening night coming up in the second week of October is going to be heavily focused on the minds of the entire Sabres family, the team, the players, the fans, coaches, front office, everything. And there are going to be a number of tributes to Jeanneret. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of those tributes in the last few days, and that's just how much Rick Jeanneret was loved around the hockey world. Jeanneret was the kind of guy where whenever an opposing team came in to Buffalo, whether it was at the old Memorial Auditorium or the KeyBank Center, it was something that you had players or opposing announcers just actually looking to see if Rick was available to be able to say hi for a few minutes. And the outpouring of support that's been received, the tributes that have already been posted, not only through the Sabres social media accounts between their Facebook, their Twitter, and their Threads accounts, and then just the outpouring of support from around the hockey world, the sympathies. Jeanneret does leave behind his longtime wife, Sandra, and his 2 children, Mark and Chris, countless grandchildren as well. Sandra was always around the arena with Rick as well. She was just as well liked and loved as Rick himself. But we're not just memorializing Rick. We're also remembering that Rick brought us some of the greatest calls in the history of the National Hockey League. Some of his calls were legendary. They were signature calls. There's there's very, very few Sabres fans or even hockey fans that loved Rick Jeanneret that much that could not narrow down their favorite calls to three, let alone just pick one. For me, it was the Alexander Mogilny when he scored 50. Isn't it nifty that Mogilny got 50? Mogilny left a vapor trail. Of course, a Mayday is up there. It's just outside the top three for me. I was always very, very preferential. Pat LaFontaine was my guy growing up. And still to this day, the only player in NHL history to play for all three New York teams between the Islanders, Rangers, and the Buffalo Sabres. But just hearing Jeanneret, going la 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 Fontaine, or I even brought it up on an episode of the Wise Guy Sports Show earlier this year. His typical call with La Fontaine around the holiday season was "'Tis the season, fa la 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 Fontaine." These guys are good, scary good when they the Jason Palmaville shorthanded winner against Ottawa. I want to say back in the '06 playoffs. But how can you pick anything other than top shelf where Mama hides the cookies? It's something that it was his signature, and we're talking for every other call that he had, the Sabres win in overtime or just drawing out everything like Chris Drury or Stu Barnes. Just the way that he had fun with players' names. Jeanneret was also inducted into so many Hall of Fames. It's not even funny. He went into the Sabres Hall of Fame in November of 2011 alongside Sabre legend and Hockey Hall of Famer Dale Hawerchuk. Everyone knows as Ducky. He was inducted into the Greater Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame in 2012. That same year, just a couple of days after that, he was given the Foster Hewitt Memorial Award, which is the award given to one of the best, which it honors a legendary broadcaster or journalist, and thus it automatically inducts that individual into the Hockey Hall of Fame. And he was inducted in November of 2012. He was inducted into the Buffalo Broadcasting Hall of Fame that September. So he was inducted into 3 different Hall of Fames in the course of about 4 months. The Bare Knuckle Boxing Hall of Fame even honorarily inducted Jeanneret in 2008 because of the way that he was so articulate and accurate with the way that he called hockey fights. Go back and watch the infamous line brawl between the Senators and the Sabres after Chris Neal cheap-shotted and knocked Chris Drury out of the game with Drury bleeding all over the ice, and just the madness that ensued. Brian Murray and Lindy Ruff, the head coaches, nearly going at it. Lindy Ruff pulling his hamstring, standing on the door that between the benches that collapsed, but then popping right back out, and the infamous visual of Rob Ray trying to cover the microphone, not to pick up all the F-bombs, which obviously did not work at that particular point because they couldn't cut the microphone on the feed, on the TV feed fast enough. Even RJ saying, you guys might want to cut the mics on the broadcast, but he was so busy calling so much he couldn't even cut his own mic because of everything else that was going on. Some of the other legendary brawls that he's called, the Philadelphia and Sabres brawl, I want to say a couple of years before that, because the Sabres were still wearing the red, black, and silver. Then the Ottawa line brawl was when they were wearing the Buffalo Slug logo, but they were wearing their throwbacks, the original royal blue with the shoulder patches and everything. And I absolutely love that they went back to that one a few years ago. It's still one of the nicest jerseys out there. Whatever, any of you Pittsburgh or Toronto or Detroit fans in the Midwest who actually say that this jersey is trash, yeah, you're lying, because retro doesn't always mean good. Jeanneret did call 2 Stanley Cup finals with the Sabres. He did call when the Sabres were in the finals back in naturally the 1999 season, which was known as the Brett Hull skate in the crease in Game 6 when that was still a rule. He also called the 1975 final where the Sabres were beaten, I want to say, by the Boston Bruins. That was a few years before I was born. My first and to this date only NHL game I've ever attended was in KeyBank Center back in 2017 against the Tampa Bay Lightning. And the irony is that that Lightning team went on to win the Stanley Cup just a couple of years later, and a couple of members of that Sabres team are still with them now, namely Kyle Okposo, who's now the captain. But Jack Eichel was a part of that team, and they were a very bad team. But Ryan O'Reilly was there as well, and then O'Reilly was going to get moved the following season to the St. Louis Blues and ended up winning a cup, and is now moved on to his third team in the last 2 years after signing with the Nashville Predators as the biggest free agent signing of this current offseason. But the tributes and everything that I've heard on the podcast from Danny Gare to Mike Doc Emmerich to the players coming on the Beyond Blue and Gold podcast, the official daily podcast of the Sabres, seeing Brian Duffy and Marty Biron, who are the studio analysts for the pregame show and the intermission show. It makes it hurt a little bit more as a Sabres fan. And Jeanneret, again, his final season did just call 20 games, citing organ failures at that point. We knew our time with Rick was going to be very limited. When his name went to the rafters, he closed his speech in front of a sold-out crowd, which was one of only a handful that year, as the Sabres started to inch very, very close and just missed out on the playoffs by 1 point last year. You could actually see the barn get packed a little bit more, and it's going to be a lot better this year. The Sabres should be able to make the playoffs and snap that legendary losing streak, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But you're hopeful that the passing of Jeanneret, who meant so much to everybody on game day, in the locker room and otherwise, doesn't hang over just how close the Sabres are to breaking through and not only getting to the playoffs, but actually starting to be contenders for deep runs in the playoffs as young as they are. It was also noted during that podcast that a longtime Sabres equipment manager, Rip Simonik, he always said that Jeanneret was one of the smartest hockey minds he's ever seen, and and I'm quoting here, his notebook was right between his ears. He knew every line and every player on every team, and while everyone else had endless piles of game notes from the host arena staff, Jeanneret really only had like a little notebook that he might have had a couple of things scribbled in. I actually remember when I was covering the Cleveland Barons of the American Hockey League for their first 5 years of existence, when I was a student reporter at Cleveland State, that I always loved getting the game notes. I still saved a couple of them. Unfortunately, I lost them in over the years, but getting the game notes was always fun especially when you're a younger reporter starting out as I was. I never covered anything in high school. I didn't do anything in junior college, and I was kind of a walk-on with the student fund with the student paper at Cleveland State, and just getting those game notes, seeing who was called up, who was being, you know, who was coming up from the AHL, who was being sent down for the from the NHL, whether they were only up there on a short stint, if they were coming in for a rehab assignment. I will never forget getting the game notes and seeing that Mika Kiprusoff, who should be in the Hockey Hall of Fame, was actually being sent down for conditioning after coming off of an injury and was going to be playing a week's worth of games, about 3 to 4 games in Cleveland, as he turned out to be the star for the San Jose Sharks and backstopped the Calgary Flames to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals, the final year before the lockout. So it would have been the 2004 Finals. And there's a lot of talk that had Calgary won Game 7, or arguably had the instant replay been available, to where the Flames probably should have won Game 6. There was a lot of people who thought that Mika Kiprusoff was going to get the Conn Smythe that year. So for me being excited getting these game notes and almost kind of relying on them 15, 20 years ago now, since I've been out of school, that Jeanneret had this level of knowledge and didn't need it with the way that the minor leagues have expanded. Call-ups and send-downs are daily fodder anymore. Just shows really how great of a hockey mind he was, and his personality, the way he called games, the humor that he had, the banter going back and forth between him and Razor on game days was legendary, and Rick is going to be severely missed. Dan Dunleavy does a very good job now, but it's going to be very somber for the first couple of weeks of the season for the Sabres with the hangover now of Rick Jeanneret's passing. So let me know what you guys think. Who is the announcer that, when you heard that they had passed away, kind of turned your world on its ear? I know in Cleveland we've had a number of them. We'll be talking about this on the Wise Guys here. Actually, we talked about this on the Wise Guys last night. I'm sorry. By the time this goes up, because I'm actually taping this on Saturday night for posting on Sunday. But again, let me know what you guys think. Comment down below. Find me on Threads. Find me on Twitter. And once the Threads web version becomes available here, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, you're probably going to see me leaving Twitter pretty much altogether before too long here. And I will see you guys a little later on this week. Take care.